Pinned against the vibrating steel of a massive harvester, Emma felt the cold edge of a betrayal she never saw coming. Her ribs groaned under the pressure of her own brother's grip, his expensive suit stained with the same grease that had defined her life. As the roar of the county fair drowned out her screams, she stared at the document clutched in her trembling hand. A master contract that didn't just sell her farm, but the very soil beneath the entire valley. Jared's golden boy mask had finally shattered, revealing a man who had traded his family's blood for a gambling debt he could never repay. "You think you're saving the land, Emma?" Jared hissed, his eyes wide and vacant. "Dad already buried us both." He shoved a crumpled legal rider into her face, bearing their father's unmistakable signature. It wasn't just the surface rights at stake. The earth beneath her feet had been signed away years ago. As the sheriff's sirens wailed in the distance, coming to arrest her for a crime she didn't commit, Emma realized the terrifying truth. She wasn't just fighting for her home. She was standing on a graveyard that had already been sold to the highest bidder. The wrench slipped again, biting into her palm. Emma hissed, wiping the blood on her thigh where the denim had already darkened with sweat and grease. The tractor's engine coughed, sputtered, then died with a final, wheezing groan. She slammed her fist against the rusted hood, the impact vibrating up her arm. Again. Heat pressed down like a second skin, thick with the stench of manure and diesel. Flies buzzed in lazy circles around the trough, their wings a constant, maddening hum. She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, leaving a smear of dirt across her temple. The bank statement in her pocket crinkled with every movement, a reminder she didn't need. The iron carcass of the machine felt like a personal insult, a heavy, unmoving weight that mirrored the state of the Larkin legacy. She had spent 5 hours under the chassis, the July sun baking the corrugated tin of the barn roof until the air beneath it was a shimmering, oxygen-starved haze. Every joint in her body ached with a dull, rhythmic throb, and the copper tang of her own blood mixed with the acrid scent of old oil. She wasn't just fighting a machine. She was wrestling with a ghost that refused to stay buried. The financial ledger in her mind was a mess of red ink and late fees. Every clank of the wrench seemed to echo the ticking clock of the foreclosure notice sitting on the kitchen table. She looked out over the parched fields, the corn stalks stunted and yellowing under the relentless Wisconsin heat. The irrigation pump had failed 2 days ago, and the repair costs were a joke she couldn't afford to hear. Her broad shoulders, built from years of dragging hay bales and wrestling calves, felt brittle today. She stared at the black grease under her fingernails, a permanent stain that no amount of scrubbing could ever truly remove. The farm was a living thing, a hungry beast that demanded more than she had left to give. She leaned her forehead against the cool, unyielding metal of the tractor, closing her eyes for a second, letting the silence of the barn swallow her. But the silence was never true. It was filled with the ghosts of her father's expectations and the crushing reality of her own exhaustion. A shadow fell across the dirt, long and thin. "You're gonna break your hand before you break that damn machine." Emma didn't turn. She knew the rhythm of that voice, the way it carried the weight of decades of dirt and disappointment. "Then I'll have 2 things that don't work." Old Man Hargrove leaned against the fence, his overalls sagging at the knees. He spat a stream of tobacco into the dust, the dark liquid vanishing instantly into the thirsty earth. Heard the banks circling, like vultures. She yanked the wrench free, metal screeching against metal. "They can circle all they want. Doesn't mean I'm dead yet." Hargrove chuckled, low and dry, a sound like dry leaves skittering across a porch. "No, but that tractor sure is." He pushed off the fence, his joints popping. "The valley's changing, Emma. I saw a black SUV down by the creek road this morning. Men in suits looking at the soil like it was gold or a grave. The mention of the suits sent a cold spike through the heat of her anger. She wiped her hands on a rag that was more grease than cloth. The land behind her stretched out, acres of history and heartache, and for the first time, the vastness of it felt like a cage. She watched Hargrove limp away, his warning hanging in the humid air like the smell of an approaching storm. She turned back to the house, her boots heavy in the dust. The porch boards groaned under her weight, a familiar, complaining sound that usually felt like home, but today felt like a warning. There, pinned to the door with a clinical, heartless precision, was the white envelope. The logo of the First National Bank of the Valley was embossed on the corner, a small, sharp emblem of her failure. She didn't need to open it to know the words inside. Final notice, seizure, vacate. The ink seemed to bleed into the paper, a dark stain on her family's name. She gripped the railing, her knuckles white, and looked out at the silos standing like sentinels against the horizon. Her father had died believing she was the one who understood the land, the one who could hold it together, but he hadn't told her how to fight a bank with a wrench, or how to keep the earth from being swallowed by the very people who were supposed to protect it. The evening light began to fail, turning the sky a bruised purple. Emma moved toward the barn, her movements mechanical. The power company had sent their own warning, and the hum of the milking machines was a luxury she was about to lose. She stepped into the dim, warm interior, where the scent of hay and the heavy, sweet musk of the cattle offered a fleeting sense of comfort. Her heritage jerseys watched her with liquid, dark eyes, their tails swishing rhythmically. These animals were the last of their line, a specific breed her mother had cherished, and they were the only thing keeping the farm's pulse beating, however faintly. She sat on the low stool, her forehead pressed against the warm flank of the lead heifer. The rhythmic ping-ping of the milk hitting the pail was the only music left in the valley. She worked with a frantic, desperate energy. The electricity could flicker out at any moment, leaving the cooling tanks useless and the morning's yield a total loss. Her hands, calloused and scarred, moved with a grace that contradicted her rugged appearance. She whispered to the cows, a low, guttural murmur that was more for her own benefit than theirs. "Just a little longer, girl. We'll get through this." But the lie tasted like ash. Every gallon of milk was a drop in an ocean of debt. She could feel the walls closing in, the corporate interests and the banking vultures tightening their grip. The weight of the heritage she carried was becoming a millstone, and as the last of the light vanished from the barn windows, Emma Larkin felt the terrifying, hollow realization that she might be the one to finally let the fire go out. The sound of a heavy engine disturbed the night, a low, predatory rumble that didn't belong to any farm equipment she knew. She stood up, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. A pair of headlights cut through the darkness, sweeping across the barn doors and illuminating the dust motes in the air. A sleek, black SUV pulled into the yard, its tires crunching on the gravel with a sound like breaking bones. Emma stepped out of the barn, the milk pail still in her hand, her silhouette framed by the dim yellow light of the interior. Two men stepped out of the vehicle, their silhouettes sharp and alien in the rural landscape. They wore suits that cost more than her entire herd, and their movements were calculated, devoid of the easy, loose-limbed gait of people who work the earth. "Emma Larkin?" the taller one asked, his voice smooth and devoid of any local inflection. He didn't wait for an answer. He pulled a heavy leather folio from under his arm and stepped toward the barn door. "We're here on behalf of TerraCorp. We have a court-ordered seizure notice for the property and all its contents. You need to step aside." The arrogance of the statement hit her like a physical blow. Emma didn't move. She felt the cold weight of the iron pry bar she'd left leaning against the doorframe. Her fingers curled around the metal, the coldness of it grounding her. "You're trespassing," she said, her voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Get off my land before I make you." The second man, shorter and broader, laughed. It was a thin, wheezing sound. "It's not your land anymore, Miss Larkin. The paperwork was filed this afternoon. We're just here to make it official." He reached out to pin a document to the weathered wood of the barn, his hand moving with a casual, dismissive authority. Emma didn't think. The pry bar swung in a tight, practiced arc, slamming into the man's wrist before the paper could touch the door. He cried out, a sharp, ugly sound that tore through the quiet of the night. The taller man lunged, his polished shoes slipping in the mud, and the confrontation turned into a desperate, messy brawl. Emma fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal, using her weight and her knowledge of the uneven ground to her advantage. She wasn't a fighter by trade, but she was a woman who had spent her life wrestling stubborn livestock and heavy machinery. She drove her shoulder into the taller man's chest, sending him sprawling into the muck, and swung the pry bar again, catching the SUV's headlight and shattering it into 1,000 glittering shards. "Get out!" she roared, the sound echoing off the silos. "Get out of here!" The enforcers, shocked by the sudden, violent resistance, scrambled back toward their vehicle. They were city men, used to intimidation and legal threats, not a broad-shouldered woman with a piece of iron and nothing left to lose. They piled into the SUV, the engine roaring as they reversed blindly, tires spinning and throwing up clods of dirt. As the vehicle sped away, a dark shape fell from the open door. A heavy leather folio, identical to the one the taller man had been carrying. It landed in the mud, a silent trophy of her small, desperate victory. Emma stood in the middle of the yard, her breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. Her knuckles were split, and her shoulder throbbed where she'd collided with the man. But the adrenaline was a hot, electric current in her veins. She walked over to the folio, her boots squelching in the dirt. She picked it up, the leather cold and expensive feeling in her grease-stained hands. Back inside the barn, under the flickering light of the single bulb, she unzipped the case. Inside was a collection of documents, but one caught her eye immediately: a topographical map of the Wisconsin Valley. She spread it out on a hay bale, her heart stopping. Her farm, the Larkin land that had been in her family for 3 generations, was circled in bright, aggressive red. Across the center of her pastures, in bold, clinical type, were the words, "Ground Zero, Waste Site." The realization hit her like a physical weight, squeezing the air from her lungs. They didn't want the land for farming. They wanted it for a grave. They wanted to turn her legacy into a dumping ground for the chemical runoff of the valley's new industrial masters. She looked closer at the bottom of the map, searching for the names of the people who had sanctioned this death sentence. There, in the corner, were the official stamps of the Regional Agricultural Board, and beneath them, the signatures. Her eyes blurred for a second, refusing to process the ink. But the handwriting was unmistakable. It was a sharp, practiced script she had seen on 1,000 childhood birthday cards and college applications. Jared Larkin, her brother, the man who had left the valley for a suit and a title, promising he would always look out for her. He hadn't just sold the farm, he had signed the warrant for its destruction. The betrayal was a cold, sharp blade in her gut. She sat on the hay bale, the map staring back at her like a mocking face. The silence of the barn felt different now. No longer a sanctuary, but a tomb waiting to be filled. She thought of Jared's smile, the way he always smelled of expensive cologne and ambition. He had known. He had sat across from her at Christmas, drinking their father's whiskey, while he was planning to bury her under a mountain of toxic waste. The anger that rose in her then wasn't the hot, impulsive fire of the brawl in the yard. It was a cold, steady flame, the kind that could burn for a lifetime. She folded the map, her movements slow and deliberate, and tucked it into her jacket. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. And for the first time in years, Emma Larkin knew exactly what she had to do. The next morning, the heat arrived early, a thick, suffocating blanket that made the air itself feel heavy. Emma was in the kitchen, the folio hidden beneath the floorboards of the pantry, when the sound of a familiar vehicle echoed up the driveway. It wasn't the predatory rumble of the SUV, but the smooth, whisper-quiet hum of a luxury sedan. She stood by the window, watching as Jared stepped out, looking every bit the protector he claimed to be. He was wearing a light gray suit, his silver-streaked hair perfectly coiffed, a sympathetic expression plastered onto his face like a mask. He climbed the porch steps, his movements graceful, and knocked on the door. Emma waited a beat before opening it, her face a mask of exhausted indifference. "Emma," he said, his voice rich with a practiced warmth. "I heard about the trouble last night. I came as soon as I could." He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, his eyes scanning the room, landing on the bank notice still sitting on the table. "God, Em, why didn't you tell me it had gotten this bad?" "I told you 6 months ago, Jared," she said, her voice flat. "You told me to hang in there." He sighed, a sound of weary frustration that probably worked wonders in boardrooms. He reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a document, laying it on the table with a flourish. "I've been working on this for weeks. It's a low-interest loan, backed by the board. It'll clear the bank, fix the tractor, and give you enough breathing room to get through the harvest. You just need to sign it, right now, so I can get the funds released before the weekend." Emma looked at the paper, then at her brother. He was smiling, that same golden boy smile that had always made people trust him. But as he leaned forward, her gaze drifted down to his shoes. They were expensive Italian leather, polished to a mirror's shine. But there, caught in the deep tread of the sole, was a smear of fresh, grayish-blue clay. Her heart skipped. That specific clay only existed in one place in the entire county, her back pasture near the creek. It was a restricted area, boggy and treacherous, where no one had any business being unless they were surveying for a foundation. "That's a lot of money, Jared," she said, her voice steady despite the roar in her ears. "Where's it coming from?" "Does it matter?" he asked, his smile faltering just a fraction. "It's a lifeline, Emma. Take it." "I need to read the fine print," she said, pulling the document toward her. "Dad always said never sign anything without knowing where the trap is." Jared's jaw tightened. He began to pace the small kitchen, his fingers nervously twirling the signet ring on his pinky. "There is no trap. I'm your brother, for Christ's sake. We're running out of time. The bank isn't going to wait another day." Emma pretended to study the legalese, her eyes scanning the lines, but her mind racing. He was trespassing. He was lying. And he was desperate. As she flipped to the second page, a sudden, sharp bellow echoed from the yard. It was the lead heifer, a sound of pure, unadulterated distress. Emma stood up, knocking her chair over. "The cows," she hissed, bolting for the door. She burst onto the porch and saw the gate to the main pen standing wide open. The lead heifer was already halfway across the field, heading at a panicked gallop toward the steep ravine that bordered the north edge of the property. The ground there was loose, a sheer drop into the rocky creek bed below. If the animal went over, it would be dead before it hit the water. "The gate was locked!" Emma screamed, not looking at Jared as she ran for her truck. She dived into the cab, the engine roaring to life with a protesting groan. She slammed it into gear and tore across the grass, the truck bouncing violently over the ruts. The heifer was nearing the edge, her dark eyes wide with terror. Emma slammed her foot on the brake to slide the truck between the cow and the drop, but the pedal went straight to the floor. There was no resistance, no pressure. The truck surged forward, a 3-ton projectile heading straight for the ravine. "No," she grunted, her hands white on the steering wheel. She yanked the emergency brake with every ounce of strength she had. The cable shrieked, the rear tires locked, and the truck fish-tailed wildly, coming to a stop mere inches from the crumbling edge of the cliff. Dust swirled around the cab, the silence that followed deafening. The heifer, startled by the noise, veered away from the drop and headed back toward the barn. Emma sat in the cab, her forehead resting on the wheel, her breath coming in jagged sobs of adrenaline. The brakes hadn't just failed. They had been cut. She could feel it in the way the pedal had given way. Clean, sudden, and absolute. She looked back toward the house, but Jared was nowhere to be seen. She climbed out of the truck, her legs shaking. She needed a rope to secure the heifer, and she needed to get back to the barn. She moved with a grim, focused intensity, her fear replaced by a cold, murderous clarity. She stepped into the dimness of the barn, the air thick with the scent of hay and the nervous energy of the herd. "Girl, you in here?" she called out, her voice echoing in the rafters. A heavy chain rattled above her. Emma looked up, but the shadows in the hayloft were too deep. Suddenly, 2 figures dropped from the loft, landing with a heavy thud on the dirt floor. They were dressed in tactical gear, their faces obscured by shadows. Jared's security detail. They didn't speak. They moved with a synchronized, professional lethalness, one swinging a heavy length of chain while the other lunged for her waist. The fight was a blur of violence and desperation. Emma used the narrow stalls to her advantage, forcing them to fight her one at a time. She swung a heavy grain shovel, the metal clanging against the chain, the impact vibrating up her arms. The barn was a maze of obstacles, and she knew every inch of it. She ducked under a swinging fist and drove her elbow into a man's ribs, hearing the satisfying crack of bone. But they were younger, faster, and they had her cornered. The taller one lunged, his hands locking around her throat in a brutal, crushing chokehold. Emma's vision began to swim, the world narrowing to a dark tunnel. She reached out, her fingers brushing against a heavy grain sack hanging from a pulley. With a final, desperate surge of strength, she kicked the release lever. The 100-pound bag swung down with the force of a wrecking ball, slamming into the man's chest and throwing him backward into a stack of crates. The second man hesitated, and Emma didn't give him a chance to recover. She turned and dived into the grain chute, the smooth wooden boards a blur as she slid down into the darkness of the lower granary. She hit the bottom hard, the air knocked out of her, but she didn't stop moving. She scrambled into the shadows beneath the floorboards, pulling a heavy tarp over herself just as the sound of heavy boots echoed on the floor above. "Find her!" a voice roared. It was Jared. The mask was gone now, his voice shrill with a frantic, ugly desperation. "Find that folio. If she gets away with those maps, we're all dead. Check the office. Check the house. I don't care if you have to burn this place to the ground. Just find it." Emma lay in the darkness, her heart hammering against the dirt. She waited until the sounds of the search moved toward the house before she crawled out from under the tarp. Her body was a map of pain, but her mind was sharper than it had ever been. She made her way to the farm office, a tiny, cluttered room tucked into the back of the farmhouse, and locked the door. She pulled the loan contract from her pocket, the one Jared had been so desperate for her to sign. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a magnifying glass, her hands trembling as she scanned the fine print. She bypassed the headers, the lifeline loan promises, and the community support fluff. She looked for the definitions, the clauses, the hidden traps. There, buried on page 14, under a section titled Ancillary Agreements, was the truth. The loan wasn't from a bank. It was a private lien, fully funded by a subsidiary of TerraCorp. And the final clause, written in language so dense it was almost unreadable, stated that by accepting the funds, the borrower waived all future rights to legal action regarding subsurface environmental alterations. It wasn't a loan. It was a gag order. If she signed, she was giving them permission to poison her land, her water, and her legacy, and she was promising never to say a word about it. She leaned back in her chair, the paper fluttering to the floor. Jared wasn't just a traitor. He was the architect of her silence. And as the sounds of her brother's men tearing apart her home echoed through the walls, Emma Larkin realized that the valley she loved was already dying. And the only person left to save it was a woman with no brakes, no money, and a map that proved the world was a lie. The road to the county fairgrounds was a gauntlet of dust and suppressed rage. Emma's truck, now equipped with a temporary brake line she'd rigged with spare parts and desperation, rattled with every mile. The fair was the heart of the valley's social calendar, a place of blue ribbons and false smiles. And today, it was the stage for Jared's final act. As she pulled into the overflow lot, the smell of fried dough and livestock hit her, a sickly, sweet reminder of everything she was about to lose. She didn't have to look far to find the first blow. Near the livestock pavilion, a crowd had gathered around her trailers. Sheriff Miller, a man whose family had shared Sunday dinners with the Larkins for decades, stood with his arms crossed, his face a mask of bureaucratic indifference. Beside him, Jared was talking to a group of reporters, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. "It's a tragedy, truly," Jared was saying, his hand resting on the sheriff's shoulder. "But public safety has to come first. We can't have diseased livestock threatening the entire valley's herd." Emma pushed through the crowd, her boots heavy in the trampled grass. "Diseased? What the hell are you talking about, Jared?" The sheriff stepped forward, holding a clipboard like a shield. "Emma, stay back. We've got a confirmed report of bovine tuberculosis in your herd. We have to impound them for testing. It's the law." "Testing? My cows are the healthiest in the state," she shouted, her voice cracking with fury. "You're stealing them." "We're protecting the community, Emma," Jared said, his eyes cold and empty. "You've let the farm go to rot. It was only a matter of time before the animals suffered too. It's for the best." The crowd of local farmers, men and women she had known her entire life, watched in a suffocating silence. She could see the doubt in their eyes, the way they looked away from her bruised face and grease-stained clothes. Jared had spent years building his image as the valley's savior, and she was just the stubborn sister who couldn't keep her head above water. As the transport trucks roared to life, hauling her heritage cows away into the dusty distance, Emma felt a hollow, aching void where her hope used to be. They had stripped her of her livelihood in broad daylight, and the world had watched and done nothing. But the void didn't stay empty for long. It filled with a cold, calculated resolve. She watched Jared walk toward his luxury mobile office, a sleek, white trailer parked behind the main stage. And she knew that the evidence she needed wasn't in the folio anymore. It was in his files. It was in the master contract that would bind the valley to TerraCorp forever. She waited until the sun began to set, the fairgrounds transforming into a neon-lit maze of noise and shadows. The security guards were distracted by the evening's festivities, their attention turned toward the beer tents and the midway. Emma moved like a ghost through the rows of equipment, her dark jacket blending into the gloom. She reached the back of Jared's trailer and pulled a short crowbar from her belt. With a sharp, practiced jerk, she forced the rear window, the glass groaning but not breaking. She scrambled inside, the air-conditioned chill of the office hitting her like a slap. The interior was a temple to corporate ego. Leather chairs, mahogany desks, and a wall of monitors displaying the valley's resources like pieces on a chessboard. She dived into the filing cabinets, her fingers flying through the tabs. Acquisitions, zoning, mineral rights. And there, at the very back, was a thick black binder labeled Project Deep Vein. She opened it, and the scale of the betrayal nearly knocked her off her feet. It wasn't just her farm. Jared had negotiated a master contract that sold the entire valley's water table to TerraCorp for industrial cooling. He had accepted millions in consulting fees, bribes in any other language, to bypass every environmental inspection and safety tax in the county. He was turning the entire region into a sacrifice zone, and he was doing it with the stroke of a pen. Looking for something, Em? The voice was like a gunshot in the small space. Emma spun around to find Jared standing in the doorway, the light from the fairgrounds casting his shadow long and distorted across the floor. He stepped inside and locked the door, his face no longer the mask of the golden boy. It was the face of a man who had seen the bottom of the hole he'd dug and realized there was no way out but down. "You're a monster, Jared," she hissed, clutching the binder to her chest. "You're killing this valley." "I'm saving myself," he roared, his voice cracking. "Do you have any idea what I owe? The people I've borrowed from don't take 'I'm sorry' for an answer. TerraCorp is the only thing standing between me and a shallow grave. And you just had to keep digging." He lunged for her, his hands clawing at the binder. The confrontation spilled out of the trailer, a brutal, stumbling mess that sent them crashing into a display of heavy industrial machinery. Jared was stronger than he looked, fueled by a sociopathic desperation that made him reckless. He pinned her against the jagged metal teeth of a massive combine harvester, his fingers digging into her throat. "Give it to me," he screamed, his face inches from hers. "Give me the contract, and I'll make sure you get out of this alive. I'll give you enough money to start over anywhere you want." Emma gasped for air, her vision blurring. She reached out, her hand closing around a heavy wrench left on the harvester's deck. With a final, guttural cry, she slammed the tool into Jared's shoulder. He howled in pain, his grip loosening, and Emma twisted away, scrambling through the maze of tractors and harvesters. "Security!" Jared bellowed, clutching his arm. "Stop her! She's stolen corporate property!" Emma ran, her lungs burning, the noise of the fair a deafening roar in her ears. She tried to head for the exit, but the black-suited enforcers were already closing in, their flashlights cutting through the dark. She was trapped in the machinery exhibit, a forest of steel and oil that offered no escape. Jared caught up to her near a vintage tractor, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't attack this time. He just stood there, a dark silhouette against the neon lights, and pulled a small, yellowed piece of paper from his pocket. "You think you've won?" he asked, his voice a low, mocking whisper. "You think that binder matters? Look at this, Emma. Look at what Dad did." He held the paper out, and even in the dim light, she recognized the signature. It was a notarized document, dated 5 years before their father's death. It was a transfer of all shared mineral rights on the Larkin estate to Jared in exchange for a debt settlement. He knew what I was, Jared said, a cruel smile touching his lips. He knew I was a gambler, and he gave me the only thing that mattered to keep me quiet. Even if you keep the surface, Emma, I own the earth beneath it. I can lease it, drill it, or poison it, and there's not a damn thing you can do to stop me. You're fighting for a grave that's already been sold. The revelation was a crushing, final blow. Emma felt the binder slip from her fingers, the pages fluttering in the wind. The betrayal went deeper than Jared. It went back to the very man she had spent her life trying to honor. She stood there, paralyzed by the weight of the lie, as the security guards closed in. "Sheriff," Jared called out, his voice returning to its practiced, authoritative tone. "Over here, I've caught the trespasser." Sheriff Miller appeared from the shadows, his face set in a grim, unhappy line. He didn't look at Emma as he snapped the handcuffs onto her wrists. "Emma Larkin, you're under arrest for trespassing, theft, and disorderly conduct," he said, his voice flat. "He's lying, Robert," she cried. But the words felt hollow. "Look at the files. Look at what he's doing." "Save it for the judge, Emma," the sheriff said, leading her away. She was marched through the fairgrounds, a fallen woman in front of the neighbors who had once been her friends. Jared followed behind, straightening his tie, preparing to take the stage for his victory speech. As the doors of the makeshift holding tent closed behind her, Emma Larkin sat in the dirt, the sound of the crowd's cheers for her brother echoing in the dark. She was discredited, penniless, and alone. And for the first time in her life, she truly believed that the land didn't care about her feelings, and the world didn't care about the truth. The holding tent was a canvas tomb, the air inside stagnant and smelling of old hay and fear. Outside, the roar of the crowd was a rhythmic, mocking pulse, punctuated by the tinny blare of the PA system. Jared was on the stage now, his voice projected across the fairgrounds, weaving a tale of progress and prosperity that tasted like poison to Emma. She sat on the dirt floor, her wrists aching from the cuffs, her mind a frantic, jagged mess of betrayal and desperation. But the Larkins were not a people who broke easily. She looked at her belt, her fingers brushing against the small leather pouch she always carried. The sheriff had been thorough, but he hadn't expected a woman like Emma to carry a professional-grade wire cutter hidden in a secret compartment. It was a tool from her years in the motor pool, a souvenir of a life she'd tried to leave behind. She moved with a silent, practiced efficiency. She extracted the thin metal shim and began to work on the electronic lock of the temporary cell. It was a modern system, designed for convenience rather than true security, and to a woman who could rebuild a tractor engine in the dark, it was a simple puzzle. The lock clicked, a small, triumphant sound that was lost in the roar of the crowd. She stepped out of the cell, her heart hammering against her ribs. She didn't head for the exit. She headed for the corner of the tent where her boots had been tossed. She reached inside the left one and pulled out the leather folio she'd snatched from the enforcers days ago. She hadn't just kept the maps. She'd found a hidden compartment in the lining, one she hadn't had the chance to fully explore. She ripped the leather open now, her fingers trembling. Inside were 3 pages of yellowed parchment, covered in her mother's elegant, flowing script. It was the original will, the one that had supposedly been lost in the fire after her mother's death. Emma's eyes blurred as she read the words, the legal jargon falling away to reveal a final, desperate act of protection. To my daughter, Emma, who has the soul of the land, I leave the farm and all rights, both surface and subsurface, in their entirety. My son, Jared, has already received his inheritance in the form of his education and his debts, and he shall have no claim to the Larkin legacy. The father's transfer had been illegal. He hadn't owned the rights to give them away. They had been held in a separate trust by her mother, a trust that Jared had tried to bury. The realization hit her like a lightning strike. She didn't just have the truth. She had the law. She slipped out of the tent, moving through the shadows of the midway like a predator. She knew the fairgrounds better than any of Jared's city-bred security. She bypassed the main gates and circled back toward the technical booth behind the stage. The technicians were distracted, their eyes glued to the monitors as they prepared the final video presentation for Jared's award. Emma didn't hesitate. She used a wire-stripping technique she'd perfected on 100 broken fences, hijacking the digital projector system with a series of quick, brutal splices. She overrode the Leadership in Progress slideshow, replacing it with the scanned images of the master contract and her mother's will. Then, she didn't run. She didn't hide. She walked up the stairs of the podium, her silhouette appearing like a ghost behind the curtains. Jared was at the microphone, his arms raised in a gesture of triumph. And so, as we look toward a future of industrial growth and corporate partnership, the only thing you're looking at, Jared, is a prison cell. Emma stepped onto the stage, the light hitting her bruised, dirt-streaked face. The crowd gasped, a collective intake of breath that silenced the fairgrounds. Jared spun around, his face pale, his eyes wide with a sudden, visceral terror. "Security!" he shrieked, but Emma was already at the microphone. "Look at the screens," she roared, her voice echoing off the silos. "Look at what he sold you. Look at the water you drink and the land you farm." The massive digital displays behind her flickered, then exploded into life. The pages of the Project Deep Vein contract appeared, the bribes, the tax evasions, and the waste disposal maps laid bare for the entire valley to see. The crowd, the farmers who had watched in silence as her cows were stolen, began to murmur. A low, dangerous sound that grew into a roar of righteous fury. "And look at this," Emma shouted, holding up her mother's will. "The farm was never his to sell. Every signature he's put on a contract is a fraud. Every deal he's made is a lie." The crowd transformed into a mob. They surged toward the stage, their faces twisted with the realization that they had been betrayed by one of their own. Jared tried to run, but the very farmers he had mocked were the ones who blocked his path. Sheriff Miller, seeing the tide turn and the evidence staring him in the face, didn't reach for his gun. He reached for his handcuffs. "Jared Larkin, you're under arrest," the sheriff said, his voice finally carrying the weight of the law. The TerraCorp representatives, seeing the collapse of their puppet, fled into the night, their black SUVs disappearing into the dust. Jared was led away, his expensive suit torn, his golden boy image shattered forever. Weeks later, the heat finally broke. A cool, steady rain began to fall, soaking into the thirsty earth of the Wisconsin Valley. Emma stood on her porch, her hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee. The heritage cows were back in their pens, their dark eyes peaceful. The farm was safe, protected by a permanent conservation easement that ensured it would never be anything but a farm. She had traded her brother for a future, and she had buried the ghosts of her parents under the truth. The valley was still a hard place, and the debts were still real. But as she looked out at the rolling hills and the greening fields, Emma Larkin finally felt the silence of the land. It wasn't the silence of a grave, but the quiet, steady pulse of a legacy that had finally found its way home. She exhaled, the weight of the world lifting from her broad shoulders. And for the first time in years, she didn't hear her father's voice in the wind. She only heard the rain.